Hi, Ariana Grande here. And I wanted to say I love the Beatles60 podcast because, following the Beatles in 1962, each episode gives you a look into our world. Peace and love. But if you want to gain real insight into the group's development and rise, real understanding of how, those lovable mop tops experienced it, the only way is to follow their incredible rise to fame daily with photos and stuff. Yeah, I'm telling you, that's how you do it. Peace and love. 60 years ago now is 1962. Following this year, in particular, gives us so much insight. Various sources are providing exactly these 1962 details every day now on social media. I'll give you the 4 best sources. Are you ready? Get a pen. I'll wait. No, I'm done waiting, so you can write these down, okay? You ready? Okay, let's see. There's the award-winning Balmy Beatle blog. Oh, that Balmy Beatle blog. Next, I follow the Twitter account at 60 Years Ago Today, and definitely join the amazing Facebook group also called It Was 60 Years Ago Today. It's buzzing, man. And my personal favourite, the only audio drama of the Beatles story in existence. This is the one, the only one. And it's called A Day in Their Life, an audio drama of the Beatles story, which takes you back even further, 64 years ago, to be precise. Will you still need them? Groovers, listen. The interwebs are full of empty infotainment and the same old about Beatles trivia. You deserve the real story. And what a trip! Go deeper every day with these Beatles60 related online thingies. The story from here just gets more amazing for you every day. Peace and love. I'm out. Ariana Grande. How do you say it? I can't put Ariana Grande. Sounds like I'm getting myself a cup of coffee or something. Ariana Grande. I'll take an Ariana. Can I get an Ariana Grande? No cream. Hold the sugar. Peace and love. Peace and love.
It's early April 1962. I'm Larry, he's Andy. In this episode, we commemorate Stu Sutcliffe. This is a tragic 60th anniversary.
Yeah, this will be a bit of a somber episode, but it really is an incredibly important part of the Beatles' story. Stu's contribution to the Beatles, and especially to John's growth, should not be overlooked. Had Stu lived, though he would not have been involved very much with the music, I would suppose, I have no doubt that he would have been a key player by way of his art, for example, throughout the Beatles story and likely beyond.
You could even imagine him playing on, the Toronto concert with John or something.
Right.
So listeners might wonder why so somber and, so like Andy just said, we're giving credit because, the Beatles wouldn't have happened without Stuart, I don't think. Wouldn't have been named the Beatles, wouldn't have had this visual style that they had.
Right.
I mean, that's really indirect. He didn't style them exactly, but
it was an influence for sure.
Yeah. And his friends, the people who were attracted to him styled them in a sense,
Yeah. Right.
And influenced them. It's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
But people who are not following every day the 60 years ago story might just feel like, okay, so he deserves credit, but why are you so distressed? Why a somber tone? And the thing is, people in our community, people who are following the 60 years ago thing, are feeling distressed and sad. It's just because it feels more present for us. 60 years ago feels very present for us because we're
yes,
we're living in 2 universes, sort of. This one and 60 years ago. Well, we'll be back after this somber music.
Part 1 of 6, Tuesday, April 10th.
Team Beatles flew to Hamburg on 2 separate trips. This creates a sort of tragedy of errors. I mean, if what happened hadn't been so incredibly tragic, it would have been like a comedy of errors. But nothing especially funny here. But this was 1962. Nobody had smartphones. Nobody had WhatsApp or Skype. The fastest, most cost-effective and efficient way to message someone overseas was by telegram. And I don't mean the app.
Right.
I mean paper typed out by electric wired messaging, whatever. The basic overview is that Paul, Pete, and John flew together to Hamburg. That's why we're calling them the Threetles.
Yeah.
And spent the evening there, having not heard that Stu had died that very day. That is also bizarre, the timing of this. Whew.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know the time of death? He died in Astrid's arm on the way to the hospital. Is that right, Andy?
Right. That is the story as told by everyone who was there. He died in the ambulance being held by Astrid. The time of death is reported in most books to be between 4 and 5 in the afternoon.
And the Threetles were in the air or at the airport or hotel. There was no hotel, was it? There was a lodging.
Right, yeah.
Or Star Club but anyway, they didn't know anything of the passing of their former member and good friend that day in the same city.
Yeah, that's one version of the story, the one told most recently by Mark Lewison in Tune In. Earlier books tell the story that Astrid met the plane carrying John, Paul, and Pete and told them right away. There is actually a recording of Pete talking about that day, which we'll include a link to, in which he says exactly that. Astrid was waiting when they got off the plane.
But wait, do you buy this, or is it left a mystery for you, or are you coming down on one side or the other?
I think I'd probably come down on one side because, unfortunately, like many stories that are told by eyewitnesses, there are things about it that don't really make much sense. For example, Pete wrote a letter home, a letter which has been published, so you can actually see it. Almost immediately after arriving in Hamburg on April 10th, it stated that their plane had arrived at 3:30 p.m., which would have been before Stu died. The letter also contains no mention of Stu or of any sad news upon their arrival. Why would he have written a letter home saying nothing about it if he had heard the news right then?
He contradicted himself. Now, when you meet him next month, is it?
In August.
In August, I want you to bring the copy of that letter and a little tape recorder with the...
Oh, yeah.
Well, I guess we have electronic devices now.
Right.
With him saying, oh, well, and just say, hey, what's this contradiction?
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be a really good introduction to him, I think.
Yeah, stick it to him.
That and asking him to sing Pinwheel Twist. That'll work.
To those who go on and on about the value of primary sources, first-hand accounts, let this example sink in. The confusion comes because they were at the airport twice in 2 days, according to Lewison and according to logic.
Yeah.
And it's probably verifiable. I'm not just saying he's guessing it. He probably has evidence for it. Some landed this day, Tuesday, and were unaware that Stu had died. That's the important point. They weren't aware, but everybody else thought they would know.
Yeah.
The others who knew landed on Wednesday, and then they all met back at the airport on Wednesday because of the telegram. But this wasn't planned. It was a last-minute meetup, right?
Right. And so we can back up here. The reason there were 2 different flights in the first place was that George had been sick with the German measles. He had even missed a few shows back in Liverpool. He and Brian decided to wait an additional day to go to Hamburg. That would be April 11th. They wouldn't start playing at the Star Club until April 13th, so they had a couple of days to get ready. When John, Paul, and Pete arrived on the 10th, there was apparently no plan for Astrid and Stu to meet them. They would see them soon enough. And those Threedles were, in any case, going to be wined and dined that evening by Manfred Weisleder. By the time of the next day's flight, the one carrying Brian Epstein and George, telegrams with news of Stu's death had been received by his mother, Millie, as well as by Alan Williams, who still had a close relationship with Stu. Brian and George were informed so that arrangements could be made for Millie to accompany them on the flight. Brian sent a message to John, Paul, and Pete to meet them at the airport when their flight arrived, but didn't tell them why. Millie Sutcliffe would later say that they assumed the news would already be known to John, Paul, and Pete.
Yeah, so such a situation, you know. So without knowing it, Brian set the Threedles up for a major shock the next day at the airport. Nobody prepared the boys for what they'd soon face. Boy, so that was a big, I don't know, I want to say mistake. It was just like, a big omission.
Yeah.
The next day is the 11th of April, Wednesday, the Threedles' second day at the airport, but for reasons that they don't even know yet. They don't even know why they're going back to the airport.
Right. They were just asked to.
And everyone assumes that they know about Stu, but they don't yet. And we'll be back after a break.
Part 2 of 6, Wednesday, April 11th.
They get to the airport, the Threedles, and they still know nothing. They expect to meet Brian and George, but are surprised instead to find Astrid and Klaus there. And wait, they wondered, where was Stu? At this moment, Paul and Pete are in for a sad shock. John is in for a total emotional breakdown. You know the story better than me. What happens?
Well, one story is just that. John, Paul, and Pete arrive, waiting for Brian and George's flight, and discover Astrid and Klaus also waiting. So where was Stu? Astrid told them the story of Stu's death. It is unlikely that I need to say what the atmosphere was. I imagine most of our listeners can imagine for themselves how everyone was feeling. But I do want to mention that several books and quotes give the impression that John's reaction was to laugh. Astrid is even quoted as saying that, but I wonder if there's an element of a language problem. One word that she used was hysterics, further stating that she and Klaus Wurman, who was also present, couldn't tell if he was laughing or crying. I don't want to go into details about what someone might look like when they are hysterical, but I don't find the description contradictory. Also, Paul and Pete both commented on this, Paul very succinctly. He said,
John didn't laugh when he heard Stuart had died, as some people have made out.
So, verdict on the John laughter story, obviously not true. Dismissed.
Right. I do want to throw in one thing. In a book called The Beatles Mock Show in Hamburg, our friend on Facebook, author Torsten
Knoblauch,
included in his book a very well-done collection of memories of the people who were around at the time of Stu's death. I cannot recommend his book enough for detailed information about that and the Beatles' Hamburg experience in general, and so we'll link to that too. Part 3 of 6, Thursday, Black Day.
Well, it's black. Means it's sort of Black Day in two different ways. It's like a black box where we don't know what really happened this day with any of the people we're following, and it's black because they all must be pretty bummed out. We don't know anything about this day. We can presume that they spent time at the lodging across from the Star Club, but that probably wasn't a very nice place to hang out.
Right. On the first night, the 10th, they had been taken to their new lodgings, better than the ones that they had before, but certainly not the Ritz. And I think we'll be talking more about that in the next episode.
Maybe they visited the club again the next day, but maybe they did just to like check out the amps or something, or set up the drums or whatever.
Yeah.
We can presume that Astrid would have introduced Millie and Nielsa for the first time, either this day or the previous night. We imagine them at Nielsa's house in Eimsbüttel, about 7 minutes north from St. Pauli by car, where Stuart had lived and worked and where Astrid still lived with her mother, Nielsa.
As for the meeting of Millie Sutcliffe and Astrid's mother, Nielsa, I can't imagine it was warm. Millie was famously extremely anti-German. Her relationship with Astrid had been so bad that when Stu and Astrid visited Liverpool, they were forced to stay with Alan and Beryl Williams instead of at Stu's home. Yeah, and you're right. There's very little to no info about that day. That'd be April 12th. Hey, I just wanted to quickly interrupt myself and Larry to add a bit of information here. Apparently, on April 19th, 1962, John wrote a letter home to Cynthia. And there are a couple of things that he wrote that are relevant to this discussion. First, he wrote that he had not seen Astrid during the last week. Of course, she had gone to Liverpool for Stu's funeral, but it would appear that the Beatles did not spend any time with her in those days right after they arrived. Second, and this will unfortunately throw some more confusion into the mix, the letter also says that the last time John saw Astrid was, quote, the day we arrived. Now, this could have just been a simple misstatement, but if it can be taken at face value, it would suggest that the original story of Astrid and Klaus meeting the Threetles flight is true, and that the story of them all meeting during the arrival of George and Brian's flight the next day is inaccurate. In the end, it's kind of an unimportant detail, meaningful only to those of us who are obsessive about knowing exactly what happened. It is absolutely the case that during this particular stay in Hamburg, John and George spent a lot of time with Astrid. There are many photos and memories recalled about those times, but it does serve as more evidence that getting history exactly correct is basically an impossible task. Sorry for the interruption. Part 4 of 6, Friday the 13th.
Cleaning lady knocks over microphones. The Beatles rock.
Well, that's the headline. Well, they did have a job to do. They were going to play their rock and roll no matter how they felt. How did they feel? Pete said,
"We were miserable for days as we settled into our new quarters in the Grosse Freiheit across the street from the Star Club."
John, as you might imagine, was the most troubled of all. Klaus Voormann was interviewed by Mark Lewison in 2006, and I find his words especially haunting.
That first night at the Star Club, John came on dressed like a cleaning woman, doing his cripple act and carrying a long wooden plank. He walked across the stage and knocked over microphones and some of the drum kit. Then he went up and cleaned the microphones. He cleaned under Paul's armpit and George's. The people in the club were laughing. They didn't know Stuart had died. They didn't know Stuart. It gave me shivers to watch it, but this is what clowns do. Being humor to tragedy. It was hilarious.
Wow. Part 5 of 6, Love, Love, Love.
I'd like to talk about 3 kinds of loving relationships. Although I'm sure the possible categories are endless, let's talk about carnal lovemaking or lusting, deep, deep friendship, and parent-child dependency in looking at the possible reasons for the intensity of the friendship or more between Stuart and John. Everyone talks about it. We just want to, see if any of this makes any sense. So I'm not talking about romance because it just wouldn't be possible at that time. I guess it could be in privacy, but they didn't have a lot of privacy. So I just skip that. Skip the romance. That's most unlikely. Taking into account the entire Beatle decade together, I suppose we know that the 4 had many women. George especially had an appetite.
Yeah, Paul said that
George liked the things that men like. He was red-blooded.
And we know that Brian liked to cruise for sex with young men. Rough trade, but especially in the early 60s, I don't think that bisexuality was discussed much. It wouldn't become cool until the glam rock era in the early 70s. Although Brian was out to the Beatles and a small group of friends and had been publicly outed, I believe, from an arrest a few years earlier, homosexuality was still widely stigmatized and not let's say, normalized yet in Western society and wouldn't be in the early 60s. There was no common concept of sexual or gender fluidity. It existed mostly unnamed and mostly unmentioned. So there was queerness, and they called them queers, but there was nothing really in between, I don't believe, in that era. And sexuality would come up only in kind of gossip or ridicule or bawdy comedy, ribaldry.
Brian had been arrested in 1957 and ultimately sentenced to 2 years probation and medical treatment for violating the Sexual Offenses Act of 1956. Though it's not clear if it happened in his case, medical treatment often included electric shock therapy.
Try to convert him without his consent? Anyway, awful, but let's put that aside. Sexuality and gender today come in so many varieties that it's hard to say what straight really means anymore, since it's now widely acknowledged that even among heterosexuals, there's so much diversity, call it heterosexual heterogeneity. Anyway, in building a confident biographical narrative, unless we're trying to appeal to prurient interest to sell sensationalized books, we have to be able to see our subjects as people too, deserving of their own privacy, and keep in mind that they deserve as much privacy as anyone, except in cases where someone's sex life is like the main part of their story. Maybe Joe Orton, for example. But to repeat, there are two good reasons to avoid sexually scandalizing biographical subjects, including Stuart and John. One is that we always have to remember not to apply today's social mores to societies in the past, and there's really no reason to sort of wonder out loud about their sex lives. I don't know much about any of the Beatles' sex lives, really. And whether it's rumor or even fact, if it adds nothing to the narrative, there's no reason to wonder out loud.
Yeah, agreed.
The Beatles, we always note, are almost in a category of their own in that we've read and heard so much about their lives that they almost seem undeserving of privacy. Well, on social media, you'll find people who hate to see this kind of reckless prying into their private lives. A lot of fans online will say, just listen to the music for fuck's sake. Skip the gossip and the psychoanalysis, right? You get that a lot. Then you get the opposite. You get people trying to imagine relationships like fictional relationships between Lennon and McCartney, for example.
Yeah, Twitter's good for that.
So it runs the gamut on social media. But I think more fans would agree that John's well-established love of Stu does warrant some exploration. It's just, I don't think it's sex. We just need to keep it reality-based, not some wild fantasy. We have a responsibility to tread prudently. So let's put the sex question aside. Not only have I never seen any evidence of physical love between them, it's not especially interesting even to wonder about that, and all evidence points to a deeper type of relationship. Lust would be, I think, a relatively shallow basis, even if some element of that did exist, and it probably didn't. I say insufficient evidence. I rule. Dismissed.
Dismissed.
The Beatles were physically close to each other and knew of or even witnessed each other's sexual adventures with women, especially during their first residency in the Reeperbahn, Hamburg, and after that. But there's no evidence of bisexuality practiced by any of the four at any time. The only one rumored to have dabbled was John, and that was with Brian in Spain.
And we'll talk about that a little bit, I'm sure, when the time comes.
I think Yoko has said that John described himself as bisexual and always talked about Stu. But on this whole question, there are probably listeners who'd like to explore the topic of John and Stu this way, even as guesswork or fantasy. But our verdict has to be, insufficient evidence, dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard talk of John loving both Astrid and Stu. Who knows? But having chatted this much about the sex angle, I think there's nothing interesting there. We need to put aside the possibility of carnal love or lust or whatever, because we have no evidence, and it has no special relevance. Stu and John, both of them, led apparently heterosexual lives. If we're fallible in inferring meaning from even known facts about the past, surely what we think we know about our subjects' private lives remains even more fallible.
Right.
Nevertheless,
What are you thinking?
if it wasn't sexual, and we doubt that it was, the Stu-John relationship nevertheless seems to have been remarkably close and intense.
And that's a pretty fair assessment. There seemed to be some kind of magnetism there that's hard to describe. Such different personalities, and yet they seemed to innately kind of understand each other. And very personal, not something that was necessarily clear to any old observer, especially if what they saw was John ribbing Stu, which was a constant around that time.
It sounds like it had to have been something truly beyond common buddy bonding. And this is why those of us who follow the story can't let go of this. That intensity has to have been relevant, and so remains relevant today, not just for understanding those two figures, but also for putting together a better and better sense of the whole Beatles origin story.
Mm-hmm.
We're compelled to explain it, however roughly or tentatively, compelled to pry into the inner life world of the friendship of these two young men. Lately, I've heard this unusual insight into John's personality in general almost, that he needed to be cared for and mothered. Yoko is the best example. It's not literally the workaday role of mother. It's more like all of the following combined. It's like this, like horse whisperer or John whisperer, empathetic, low-key life coach, somebody who can make things happen, a best friend, full of the right practical wisdom, someone unusually hip, at least in John's estimation, and somebody he looks up to.
That's a good list.
Yeah. And that well describes Yoko, absolutely, right?
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
And she was one of a tiny handful of people in his life who filled that quiet but essential role. If this is a real thing. Some were lovers, well, just Yoko was. Some were all of the above, but not especially hip. Brian may be the only example of that.
Yeah.
He was hip in his own way, but
not in the same kind of world, social class as them, but yeah.
Yeah. One was his actual mother. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not talking about Mimi, but, Julia.
Yeah.
The list is very short. You can probably guess my list. I will suggest only 5 individuals. I'll tell you in a few minutes. And I've already revealed 3, I think.
Yeah, really.
Meanwhile, I should stress that this isn't my original insight, but this is a way of understanding John that's being tossed around in informed circles. We find this in historical studies. It's not intuitive. You think that over time we lose knowledge, or we lose facts, or we lose understanding or meaning. And so things become more and more blurry. Mm-hmm. But especially in the terms of meaning, if you take, for example, what the Pali Canon means, that's what Buddhism is based on, these scriptures written after the Buddha's time. But we understand it better and better because there are Buddhist scholars all over the world that study the Pali, and they do better interpretations and better translations of the Pali into English and other languages every year. And every year they get together and it's like, so if that meant this, then this, things just start making sense in different ways. So that maybe facts, well, we do uncover new facts too by artifacts turning up out of nowhere.
Right. Yeah.
But also meaning itself. Sometimes we misunderstand things from the past and we start understanding it better later on.
We hope to.
We hope to. So if it was an analysis of anyone else, I think this would feel like gossip or very unclear. But so much is known and written about John Lennon that this sounds to me pretty plausible. And he was a pretty open person. So, but although he was an open person, but he also admitted to putting disinformation out there intentionally, which is clever. There's still no wide consensus regarding the amount of emphasis that this deserves, but probably less emphasis than I'm giving it. I'm just doing this because I'm trying to lay out the full case. I don't really,
right.
And I want to acknowledge again that some people hate to hear armchair psychoanalysis performed on a deceased stranger by, say, a podcast host. Although my social psychology degree required one overview course in personality. I don't know if that counts. True, we're not psychoanalysts, not trained and not seasoned. But so much is known about John Lennon that I think biographers and consumers of biographies, are understanding his personality better and better over time.
Yeah, I think that seems accurate.
John changed the world. Nothing in understanding his weakness is meant to disrespect him. I look up to him.
Right there with you.
At the same time, I have to admit that this mothering role sounds like infant toddler encouragement. Like, come on, you can do it. It sounds embarrassing to say that one of the most brilliant figures of his time was so insecure that he needed this type of support. But let's remember, we all have personalities. There's nothing scandalous about this, or at least nothing scandalous intended. Before I lay out this growing understanding of John's unique personality and this team of motherers who made his better self possible, Andy, why don't you go over the evidence of simply a deep, deep friendship? What all do we know about the friendship that isn't in much doubt? Later, I'll explain the mothering thing.
Okay. Stuart was 4 months older than John and 1 year ahead at the Liverpool College of Art. They were introduced by Bill Harry and would hang out at the Crack along with Rod Murray. The four called themselves the Dissenters. There's a plaque dedicated to them at the Crack to this day. Like I said, they were kind of opposites. Stuart was small, meek, quiet, wore his glasses all the time. John was bigger, louder, more obnoxious, if you will, and didn't care if he couldn't see without his glasses. In a sense, they kind of completed each other. One thing they figured out immediately was that they loved the same authors, Orwell, Steinbeck, Huxley, etc.
Oh, that set of authors, it makes sense.
Yeah. Tony Carricker, another friend and fellow Liverpool College of Art student, talked about how both he and John looked up to Stu. They admired his artistic skill as well as his gentle personality. Klaus Voormann would later say that
Stuart looked down on John, not in a bad way. I've seen letters between them, and you get the feeling of a wise man talking to someone who's a little helpless. That was Stuart and John, respectively.
Of course, in public, John couldn't really let on exactly how he felt, and that brings up the idea of what did Stu see in John? As I alluded to before, John, sometimes along with Paul, would make fun of Stu and belittle him, and not letting him eat with them, making him sit in the back of the van alone, and on and on. Stu would put up with it, likely because he knew it was just John's way, fueled by insecurity. There was a letter that Stu wrote where he said about John,
"We knew there beat a human heart, a heart as kind and gentle as could be. He really hated hurting people, and he hated himself for doing so."
Wow.
Yeah. Also, as much as John admired Stu's artistic skills, Stu admired John's rock and roll skills. And though he didn't ultimately want to be a musician for his whole life, he did say in letters home that he was getting the rocker out of his system. There was a part of him who wanted to know what it was like to be like John. Now, regardless of Stu's motivations, Larry, I know you want to talk about that common thread in many of John's relationships, Stu included. So what is up with that?
Yeah, okay, about the mothering thing. Let's see, where did I get this? I vaguely recall that I started noticing John's need for special care while I was listening to various episodes of another podcast called Another Kind of Mind, which I recommend to those interested in these sorts of insights.
Yeah, it's a great one. Highly recommended.
Now, we don't have time here to go into all the evidence that it's based on, but this is a plausible way of understanding John. It's really pretty straightforward and packed with explanatory power. It fits perfectly with what's known about all 5 relationships he had with those who definitely would have been able to fill this role. So who were the 5?
Tell us.
If you're thinking strong woman versus weak woman, please put that out of your mind for a moment. It's like people say, like, Cynthia wasn't enough to be a Mimi. He needed Yoko to be a Mimi. This is something totally different from that.
Yeah.
In fact, I would put Mimi and Cynthia in the same basket. This is something different. So mothering here would not refer to Mimi, Cynthia, May Pang sense of ordinary looking after. They all did a great job, I'm sure, and they're all interesting people at least,
Yeah.
But I'm thinking more the ways that Julia, Stuart, Paul, Brian, and Yoko eased his insecurities, helped him keep his guard down, encouraged him to be his better self, and inspired him to offer his more pro-social rather than anti-social gifts outward.
Mm-hmm.
This string of John motherers was a small group of people who were close enough to know how to support him and had some interest in filling the role. They each did it discreetly. I mean, they didn't know they didn't probably have a name for it.
Right.
And he probably didn't ask for it exact in so many words, but people just naturally knew he was somebody who needed this, he just obviously needed it.
Yeah.
I guess, if it's true. When these people leave him at their own various points, that is, when each one exits John's day-to-day life, either by dying or going away or sending him away, it seems that John's he experiences something beyond just ordinary grief or need in these times. He falls apart internally and outwardly puts up his worst facade. So, in other words, to see what happens to him when there's the absence of this special care, we've seen what happens to him. Better to give an example here.
Yeah.
When Brian dies, John starts hiding himself away in Weybridge, in Surrey, unproductive and directionless, except on those occasions when Paul would phone with another project and call him into the city. Another example is The Lost Weekend in 1973 and into 1974.
Right.
No offense to May Pang. I dig her. She probably gave him various types of care competently as needed, but wasn't maybe mature enough at the time to be able to give him this special mothering that would have eased his feelings of insecurity and helped him to recalibrate his direction. There's no doubt they had a good relationship and she provided some inspiration. A bird of paradise, right?
Yeah.
But this was obviously the period when he hit his lowest of lows. No motherers around. Well, that was apparently the last time he would ever suffer the trauma of this loss of mothering, in this case, the loss of Yoko. He hits bottom. But right then, in the mid-70s, a miracle happens. After a life of care-getting, he recalibrates. I'm talking after he returns to the Dakota. Or maybe just before he returns to the Dakota. He returns to New York, sobers up, gets the band together. It's like, come on, let's do this. Goes to the record plant and really gets his shit together and starts going on the radio everywhere and like taking control. So for the first time ever, he can himself be a caregiver. And that's why his parenting of Sean is such a beautiful episode in his story. People think it's unfair that Julian couldn't have received this care from John when Julian was a child. But I'm sorry, Julian. John was also a kind of child at the time, so how could he? He wouldn't fully evolve until 1975.
And that's an interesting insight. I hadn't thought about it that way before. Just the idea of becoming more mature seemed to make sense, but becoming a caregiver himself is an intriguing take.
And like going back to 1974, when he's in LA, first of all, we notice how needy he was for the mothering because the frequent calls with Yoko. I doubt that she was initiating those calls. I don't know, but do you know?
I don't know.
Without that, I wonder, boy, if he how could he hit more of a bottom, than he hit? It's interesting to note that it required one of John's mothers to swoop in and rescue John from his lost weekend. It was a very small team, the John Motherers, those who knew what he needed. Remember, I listed only 5 that I know of. Yoko was one, but she was waiting at the Dakota far, far away from Los Angeles. She was on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Mm-hmm. That separation was the whole point. So she wasn't available to rescue him. Julia, Stuart, and Brian weren't available for obvious reasons. Of the small team of John Motherers, who does that leave out?
Well, that would be Mr. McCartney.
I think so.
Yeah.
The ones who had the special personal know-how required to guide John out of his mess. Paul was the only one on Earth available, and the task fell to him. Did Yoko, call him and ask him, or do you know?
This will be something for when we get 60 years from then, probably. That's when my research will get there, yeah.
We don't know, right? Okay. I think it's one of them said somewhere that, I think Paul is.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
Listeners, contact us and let us know how that all happened. How did Paul know?
Click the message button.
Because Paul was bringing a message from Yoko, and he said it that way. So Paul accepts the mission. He flies to LA with that specific purpose. It's so beautiful in a way, isn't it? And Yoko's separation strategy succeeded in changing John's life. She really did show him the meaning of success. And we'll return to 1962 in a moment, but let's just make a mental note. We see that there are productive periods when John has someone to assist him in coping with his insecurities the right way. And conversely, when he finds himself motherless, we see periods of withdrawal, of self-destruction, and his jerky facade. The asshole with a tampon in his head.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the theory. Sorry it took me so long, a lot of explaining to set it up, but there it is, the general idea.
It gives me a lot to think about. That brings back to me that whole idea of the quote from Klaus from earlier.
Stuart looked down on John, not in a bad way. I've seen letters between them, and you get the feeling of a wise man talking to someone who's a little helpless. That was Stuart and John, respectively.
That was Stuart and John, respectively.
Someone who's a little helpless.
Indeed.
Now, so finally we're getting to the specific question. By staying in Hamburg, did Stuart leave John helpless back at the end of 1960? He stays in Hamburg. Did he leave John helpless without this special assistance? In mourning Stu's death, John must have felt really permanently abandoned. Although I don't know if we see Stuart doing mothering. Oh, I guess we do, because Klaus pretty much described it, didn't he? Right,
and the letters that went back and forth between them, a lot of them still exist.
Okay, right. So the other guys might not have even noticed, probably.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe John did feel really permanently abandoned. We can't go back in time and enter John's mind, but you do find at least nuggets of sense in this explanation, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
And even when Stu was still alive but living and studying in Germany, did this loss of this daily Stu attention as far back as the end of 1960 create something of a directionless, insecure period for John?
It was definitely a low time for John over the next many months after Stu had left the group. It was the time when he was unsure if the Beatles would even continue, that we've talked about before. And that the Beatles may have met Brian just at the right time as they were thinking, is this over? Some 6 months or so after Stu quit, just in time to help pull John out of it and give him some hope. And there was no question of Brian's kind of motherly treatment of all the Beatles, helping with their style, their hair, how to act on stage, etc. But it was more than that for him. He really loved them like a real mother would. And some would say John in particular. Add to that the evolution of Paul into an adult. He was in a position to take on the role of John's closest relationship and was mature enough to handle it at that point. And he was there. John and Stu like we said, did continue to communicate regularly, like those letters that Klaus talked about. But when Stu died, Paul was right there. As we mentioned a bit last time, it was in the next few months that the John and Paul songwriting machine really started grinding the gears. And of course, those songs were the tangible result of their relationship.
I would have, if I were John, I would have thought Stu was already out of the picture in a way,
He was certainly distanced. Yeah.
Yeah. But, no, I'm famously one of the only people on planet Earth who has not seen this documentary of Get Back.
Right.
But in 1969, I have seen many clips. The movie cameras and mics actually capture Paul's mothering of John, rebuilding his confidence. In so many ways. I mean, the clips I've seen, I think that Paul is just very kind to John and very patient.
Yeah.
And quiet, like, okay, John, come on, get your shit together. Is that accurate, or I haven't seen it, so tell me.
No, I think that's right. There's one scene that I'm reminded of. Soon after George left the group for what ended up being for just a few days. And of course, if you haven't seen it, that's a spoiler, right? George leaves for a few days. Well, John didn't come in to rehearse either. They show Paul and Ringo kind of sitting together sullenly, very quiet. But when John is eventually reached by phone, Paul is seemingly the only person he wants to talk to. And Paul is asked, do you want to talk to John? Paul is up like a shot. He can't get to the phone fast enough.
So the role is understood in both sides, kind of.
Yeah. Right.
Without being named again, but yeah, you're needed. Mr. Mothering, you're needed.
Yeah.
I want to remind listeners to take this John Mothering idea with a grain of salt. It really fits. It seems to explain a lot about those of us who've never interacted with John, or the five really don't know all of this for certain. We could be off, If people who knew John are hearing this and think that we're off, sorry. But I wanted to present the idea in detail and see if it explained the Stu-John relationship. And it did seem to fit to some degree, at least. But our methods of trying to make sense of the past, as we say, are always fallible. This particular understanding of John's personality is new to me, or new-ish. I knew he had insecurities about his voice, which it's insane, isn't it? Because he's like the best voice in all of music, but okay. He had insecurity about his voice, but this is just another angle, I suppose. It's impressive in that it explains a lot. Is that correct? Maybe someone can ask Paul or Yoko.
Yeah, good luck with that. Part 6 of 6, The Funeral.
The Beatles wouldn't make it. They were in Hamburg, but they were well represented, weren't they?
Yeah, mostly so. Brian was there and presented a wreath that included the Beatles' names. Cynthia, the future Mrs. Lennon, attended, as did George's mother, Louise. Also there were Alan and Beryl Williams, of course, as well as Astrid and Klaus made the trip.
According to TuneIn, it was a small gathering, and I'm just looking for things to say.
A small gathering, yeah.
Well, podcasts can lose listeners with too much silence. Instead of silence, how about just a moment of somber music?
Yes.
If you really want to follow the 60 years ago timeline with us, we think it's a daily review. So no need to wait 2 weeks for the next podcast. You can find us on social media and follow daily. See the links in the episode notes.
Please do.
And please do subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Link is in the episode notes.
The voice of Klaus Foreman was provided by our own Rensfer. Thanks, Larry. Voices of Pete Best and Paul McCartney were provided by Eric Howell. Eric's wonderful audio drama of the Beatles story is called A Day in Their Life, and it can be found at Beatledrama.com. It's theater of the mind, and we hope you'll give it a listen. Thanks, Eric.
Well, bye for now.
Take care, everyone. Until next time.
He was a bit red-blooded. Jaws like the thing men like, you know. That's the thing, really, that we're trying to say. Jaws like the things men like. Really. All right, sorry. Okay, hang on. He was red-blooded, that one. John didn't laugh. John... Hang on. Okay, here we go.
Do you think we should do this section over? Did I do all right so far?
I think so.
Kind of there's a little bit fucked up syntax here and there, but
well, that's conversation.
yeah, we leave it.
Yeah.
As we settled into our new quarters in the Gross Freiheit across the street from the Star Club. One more. In the Gross Freiheit across the street from the Star Club. Okay. He was red-blooded, la.